reports from the world's second largest continent. Hello, I'm Alison Lagrange. A very warm welcome from Durban, South Africa. We get you the news and the newsmakers from Africa. From elections to climate change to innovations and opportunities. As the world's attention shifts, we report from Africa, the heart of the global South. Join me every weekday live on First Post. Hello and welcome to First Post Africa, where we get you the top stories from the continent and from across the world. I'm Alison Lagrange, coming to you live from Durban, South Africa. First, let's take a look at the headlines. At least 4 people die and over 50 are missing as flash floods wash away a village in the northern Indian state of Uttarakhand. The Kremlin slams US President Donald Trump's threat to raise tariffs on India over its purchase of Russian oil, saying sovereign countries have the right to choose their own trading partners.
Offshore oil.
Thailand approves the purchase of 4 Swedish-made Gripen fighter jets in a $600 million deal, just a week after reaching a ceasefire following deadly border clashes with Cambodia. Thousands of Bangladeshis gather in the capital of Dhaka for rallies, concerts and prayer sessions to mark the first anniversary of the deadly protests that ousted Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. And a one-in, one-out deal allowing the UK to return migrants arriving by small boats to France in exchange for accepting asylum seekers with British family ties comes into force. The agreement aims to curb record irregular channel crossings. Hello and welcome. Let's start with the war in Ukraine. As the war drags on, Ukraine's President Zelensky is losing Africa's support, despite desperate efforts to garner support from the continent, where Moscow continues to have a stronghold. Now, the Ukrainian president has accused African mercenaries of supporting Russia in the war. In a post on X, Zelensky said that Ukrainian troops in northeastern part of the country were fighting foreign mercenaries from several parts of Africa and also from China and Pakistan. Zelensky has previously accused Moscow of recruiting Chinese fighters for its war effort against Ukraine, but Beijing denied these claims. Meanwhile, Russia's close ally, North Korea, has openly vowed unconditional support for Moscow in the war. Pyongyang has provided thousands of its own troops in Russia's Kursk region. And as far as Africa is concerned, Russia's presence and influence runs deep across the continent. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Russia is the largest weapons supplier to Africa. Moscow soldiers and mercenaries guard presidents in several West and Central African countries, while Russian mining companies are entrenched in the Sahel region that includes Mali. Moscow's intelligence agencies have also a long-standing presence in the continent. In total, Russia has around 40 missions in Africa and recently announced plans to open 7 more. Earlier in June, the Kremlin said that Russia would increase cooperation with African countries, including in sensitive areas such as defense. And it is not just limited to trade and security. Russia's narrative about Ukraine is also echoed by several African nations. Russia has accused the West-backed Ukraine of destabilizing the Sahel region, though Ukraine has strongly denied these claims. Last year, Mali ended diplomatic ties with Ukraine over allegations that Kyiv aided an attack by armed groups in the West African country, in which Malian soldiers and Russian mercenaries suffered heavy losses. Though Zelensky is trying his best to befriend African nations to counter Russia, his efforts have not been that fruitful. In June, Ukraine opened its new embassy in Mauritania. It is among the 8 embassies it has opened in Africa since the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. Despite the offer of military training, Ukraine's wartime effort to win African allies has largely focused on food. And just with food aid and opening of new missions, Kyiv is not likely to match an opponent with deep commercial and security ties in Africa. Now, for more on this, we have with us Ben Aris. He is the editor-in-chief of the BNE Intelli News and a political analyst, joining us live from Berlin, Germany. Welcome to Firstpost Africa.
Thanks for having me, Alison.
Now, what evidence, if any, has Ukraine provided to substantiate President Zelensky's claims about the involvement of African mercenaries on the Russian side in the northeastern battles?
Well, so far it's been a bit thin, in so much as, with the case of the Koreans, the North Korean troops that were fighting in Kursk, several of them were captured, documents were captured, passports proving their nationality. In the case of the Chinese, I think there was only 2 soldiers that were captured, but again, documentary evidence, passports showing that. The African claims seem to be based on troop reports. The Ukrainian troops in the field are reporting that they've seen and fought against Africans. But there's been no captures, there's been no passports produced so far, so it seems to be anecdotal. And Zelensky's tweeting this. I mean, he's claiming, and I think it's quite clear that the Russians are recruiting in Africa. They're recruiting amongst all their friendly countries at the moment in order to bolster their troops, because this is a war of attrition. Russia's losing huge numbers of people and is trying to feed the pipe, as it were, to keep fresh troops in the front line if it can.
Right. And Ben, what are the possible motivations, be it financial, political, or ideological, for individuals from African countries to join the conflict on behalf of Russia? And how are these mercenaries typically recruited?
So that's a good question, in so much as the North Korean troops that were sent were ordered there by the government. It was done at a president-to-president level. However, the recruitment that's going on by the Russian forces in Africa, I think, is being done on the basis of mercenaries. And you have to be aware that Russia, as you mentioned in your report, is deeply invested into Africa. It has excellent relationships with a lot of the countries which it was supporting since Soviet times during their independence fights. And moreover, more recently, it's been invested into Africa militarily, first by the Wagner organization, a private military company. And that was hired by various leaders, governments, dictators, coupists, in order to train their soldiers. In the meantime, since Pirogin death, who ran it, it's become a state-run thing, the Africa Corps, which is now directly under the control of the Russian Ministry of Defense, and they continue to recruit. So there's a whole pool of African soldiers, trained soldiers, that have been trained by the Russians, who they're in contact with. And yes, as you implied, they're just being offered money, they're being offered incentives to come, but there's also been reports of false promises. They've been told they've got a job in a factory and don't, and coercion, people kidnapped. And the Russian side is just trying to get the bodies on the planes into the front line in Ukraine any way it can.
And how might Zelensky's public accusation affect diplomatic relations between Ukraine and African nations, especially given Kyiv's recent outreach efforts across the continent?
Exactly. It's actually going to be probably fairly damning. As I mentioned, Russia has relationships with Africa for 70 years. The Ukrainian effort in order to bring Africans on board was launched in 2022 after the war had started. And so it's very late into the game. And what they've been doing is they've been actively touring Africa and selling the line that Russia is a neo-colonialist power. But then that's been Putin's line, is that, the West, who he's fighting, is and has been a colonialist power. And it plays very well. Russia has a lot of sympathy amongst the Africans who point to the fact that Russia never had any colonies, or the Soviet Union never had any colonies in Africa. Quite the opposite. It was on the opposite side. And Zelensky, the Ukrainians, they don't have the same argument. They have to sell it on a moral basis. And if Zelensky's now turning around and saying, African nations are supplying men to the Russian forces, that's going to hurt the relations, particularly as it's not government to government. This is probably just individuals who've been, recruited by the Russian African courts and trained. And if Zelensky is accusing African countries of basically supporting Russia at a time when most of them are supporting Russia, diplomatically at least, then that's going to be damaging and undermine his position.
Ben, it's always great to have you on the show. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure, anytime.
Now, just like the rest of the world, Africa too is adjusting to the new reality of US President Donald Trump's tariff war. Countries across the continent have been slapped with some of the steepest duties, and it is threatening businesses, exports, and entire economies. While Washington shuts the door, another global power is opening the gates, and that is China. As the US slams harsh tariffs on African exports, the rival China is stepping in, offering a zero-tariff lifeline to the continent. On the 31st of July, President Donald Trump announced a new round of reciprocal tariffs set to take effect on the 7th of August. Several African nations are now facing the heaviest duties, just like the rest of the world. Africa, too, is adjusting to the new reality of this tariff war. Now, on the 31st of July, President Donald Trump announced a new round of reciprocal tariffs set to take effect on the 7th of August. Several African nations are now facing these heavy duties. South Africa, Libya, and Algeria face a 30% tariff, the highest in Africa. Tunisia has been hit with a 25% levy. 18 other countries across the continent face a 15% duty under the new policy. No trade deal was reached between Washington and any African nation before the deadline, despite multiple attempts from the continent to negotiate avoidance. Now, Africa's place on the White House priority list remains clear and low. Reactions have been mixed. While some African nations are yet to respond formally, South Africa, which had been in talks for months, has called the tariffs unjustified. Lesotho, which was earlier hit with a 50% tariff in earlier rounds, has declared a trade emergency. And while the new rate was reduced to 15%, officials say the damage is still severe.
Buyers have cancelled to place orders emanating from Lesotho. So this says, as we speak now, most workers, they're at home. They were put on short time. So it means the 15% didn't make the difference, because the orders are not coming.
Specific cultivars are planted for the USA, and if we have to go India or China, we're probably going to look at our variety basket and change it up, and that takes 6, 7, 8 years for you to actually change your basket, and with a lot of capital.
Amid this chaos, China has emerged as a ready partner. It has now reaffirmed its commitment to offering zero-tariff access to products from 53 African countries. This move was originally announced during the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, held in Beijing on the 11th of June. The only exception remains Eswatini, the only African nation that recognizes Taiwan. China's ambassador to Ghana recently highlighted this opportunity, noting that China's 400 million middle-income consumers present a massive, untapped market for African goods. He conveyed Beijing's message to African businesses to leverage this access while they can. China is already Africa's largest trading partner, accounting for roughly 20% of Africa's exports in 2023, according to the IMF. Now, China imports raw materials like oil and minerals and exports finished goods, machinery, and electronics. China is also the largest bilateral creditor to Africa, financing major projects in infrastructure, energy, and mining. While there are growing concerns over China's expanding trade footprint and zero-tariff policy, many fear that African countries are becoming too reliant on Beijing. Cheap Chinese products could flood local markets, undercutting African industries and stifling domestic growth. But experts warn President Donald Trump's tariff push may be backfiring. Instead of pressuring China, it's pushing African nations right into Beijing's arms. So China's zero-tariff offer isn't just economic, it is deeply strategic. It expands Beijing's influence across the continent, while the United States, under President Trump, appears to be closing doors and losing ground. While President Donald Trump escalates trade tensions with Africa, he is simultaneously striking migration deals with African nations to deport U.S. migrants. Now, Rwanda has become the latest country to accept deportees from the United States. Rwanda has agreed to accept up to 250 migrant deportees from the U.S. as the Trump administration takes a hardline stance on immigration. Now, the deal was reportedly signed in June between the U.S. and Rwandan officials in Kigali, the same month that Washington brokered a peace deal between Rwanda and the DRC. As per reports, the U.S. has already sent an initial list of 10 individuals for vetting. Rwanda's government says the agreement is rooted in its national values of reintegration and rehabilitation, with officials pointing out that nearly every Rwandan family has experienced displacement. This, as Rwanda says, its people are still recovering from the 1994 genocide that killed over 800,000 ethnic Tutsis. The agreement comes as immigration takes center stage in President Trump's policy agenda, particularly the push to deport migrants to third countries with whom they have no ties. The administration has reportedly approached at least 15 African countries for such deals. The U.S. has already deported migrants to South Sudan and Eswatini after the Supreme Court cleared the way following a long legal battle in lower courts. Meanwhile, some African nations are seizing this immigration focus as a diplomatic opportunity to build goodwill with Washington, which has not historically prioritized the continent. The Trump administration argues that third country deportations help remove migrants quickly, including those with criminal convictions. However, Rwandan officials have clarified Kigali will not accept criminals or individuals still serving prison sentences. Only those who have completed their sentences or have no criminal charges will be accepted. This, as there is no legal agreement that allows Rwanda to host convicted persons still serving time in the U.S. Rwanda will receive U.S. funding in the form of a grant to support immigration processing and training programs for integration. This is not Rwanda's first migration deal. Kigali has positioned itself as a destination for migrants that Western nations want to remove. The United Kingdom struck a migration deal with Rwanda in 2022 to send third country migrants who entered the UK illegally. But the plan collapsed after Keir Starmer's Labour government came to power and amid strong legal challenges in UK courts. And Rwanda had also accepted migrants from Libya in 2019 who were deported while trying to reach Europe. But these deals have been met with sharp criticism inside Rwanda. Analysts have labeled the agreements as a form of Western neocolonialism, describing them as ethically questionable on many levels. They argue that Rwanda, or any African nation, should not shoulder the burden of migration crises created by wealthier Western countries. Human rights organizations have also raised serious concerns over Rwanda's track record, including allegations of repression of dissent and restricted freedoms. But as migration takes center stage globally, such third country deportations may now be the new reality, despite the legal challenges and ethical debate that continues to grow. And for our last story, let's turn to South Africa, where a white farm owner and 2 of his employees are on trial over the alleged murder of 2 black women in August last year. The 2 women were allegedly shot dead while looking for food on a farm in South Africa's northern Limpopo province. The women were reportedly looking for soon-to-expire dairy products, and what happened next is the most bizarre and horrifying part of this case. After being killed, the bodies of the 2 black women were allegedly fed to pigs to clear the evidence. The 3 men also faced charges of attempted murder for shooting at the husband of one of the women who was present at the farm at the time of the killing. Other charges include possession of an unlicensed firearm and obstructing justice for allegedly dumping the bodies in the pig enclosure in an attempt to conceal evidence. This case has sparked outrage across the country. It has been more than 3 decades that South Africa ended the racist system of apartheid, but such racial tensions remain high in rural areas. In South Africa, white minority hold most private farmland, while most farm workers are black and poorly paid. This continues to fuel resentment among the black population. While many white farmers complain of high crime rates, though South Africa has one of the highest homicide rates in the world, but whites do not make up a disproportionate number of victims. Now, South Africa does not release crime figures based on race, but the latest figures reveal that nearly 7,000 people were murdered in the country between October and December of 2024. Of these, 12 were killed on farm attacks. 1 was a farmer, while 5 were farm dwellers, and 4 were employees who are likely to have been black. Now, certainly these numbers are not big enough to be labeled as a white genocide, as US President Donald Trump has repeatedly claimed. South Africa is currently facing the wrath of Trump's tariffs, and one of the reasons why the Ramaphosa government has not been able to strike a trade deal with the US is Trump's claims of white genocide and seizure of white-owned land in South Africa. In May, Trump granted refugee status to more than 50 Afrikaners from South Africa, citing unverified claims of a white genocide. Afrikaners are a white ethnic group in South Africa who primarily descended from Dutch, German, and French settlers. Trump's move to open his arms and his country to the Afrikaners comes as he continues to crack down on immigration harder than ever. Later in the same month, in a dramatic White House meeting with Ramaphosa, Trump repeated his claims that white farmers are being systematically targeted in South Africa. Both Ramaphosa and the UN human rights agencies have denied the allegations. Trump was even accused of distorting figures and videos to prove his point. Though Trump's white genocide claims in South Africa seem entirely baseless, such cases of alleged racial violence continue to stir unrest and to heat up the debate on racial discrimination even decades after apartheid was abolished. And that's all we have for you on the show for today. We will see you again at the same time tomorrow. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.